Hello, my friend. The world of magic, filled with legends and ancient tales, is opening its gates once again. Tonight, in the Gryffindor dormitory by the crackling fireplace, I will share another story with my friends. Join us, for the magic is about to come alive. The wizarding world slept beneath a sky full of stars, unaware of the whispering that curled through the tunnels beneath Gringotts' wizarding bank. The marble halls above gleamed in the moonlight, their enchanted torches flickering softly, casting no shadow, revealing no secrets. But far, far below, where no wizard nor goblin ventured willingly, something was stirring. It began with a sigh, deep in the belly of the bank, where the lowest vaults lay untouched for centuries. A ripple in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm. The enchanted steel and stone that had stood undisturbed for lifetimes shuddered, as if something ancient had drawn a breath. And then came the sound, a dull, echoing click, not loud, but final, a lock undone. A whisper of dust, long settled, swirled as unseen magic slithered through the tunnels, weaving through walls, reaching where it had not reached in an age. Somewhere in the depths, something had been freed. Harry Potter stood outside Gringotts, staring up at its gleaming white facade. Years had passed since he last set foot here, and yet the memory of a dragon bursting through the entrance, its wings tearing through the sky, the scent of fire and gold thick in the air, still clung to him. But tonight, there were no dragons, no curses, no escaping vault thieves, just a summons. The goblins had called upon the ministry for help, a break-in, but unlike any before. Not a single coin of gold stolen, no treasures disturbed. And yet, something had set the goblins on edge. Harry had not hesitated. Gringotts was more than just a bank. It was the vault of wizarding history, a place of magic older than Hogwarts itself. If something had been disturbed, it was no ordinary matter. "Mr. Potter," came a gravelly voice. A goblin stood at the grand doors of the bank, his sharp eyes studying Harry with something more than suspicion, something closer to unease. His name was Gornook Ironvein, a goblin elder, and his long fingers gripped the edge of his cloak as though bracing himself against an invisible wind. "We appreciate your urgency," Gornook said, his voice low. "Come inside." The vast marble entrance hall was empty, odd for even at this hour Gringotts never truly slept. Harry's boots echoed too loudly against the floor as he followed the goblin. "We are not alone," Gornook murmured. Harry stiffened, his hand twitching toward his wand. "Not thieves," Gornook clarified. "But the vaults are listening. The walls are not as still as they should be." A chill prickled down Harry's spine. The deeper they walked, the more the air thickened, as though magic itself hung suspended, waiting. "Something was stolen," Gornook continued as they reached the edge of the hall. Before them an iron-wrought spiral staircase descended into darkness. But not gold, not treasure, we do not yet know what. Only that it was taken from vaults long since sealed, and you don't know by whom. Harry asked. Gornock hesitated. Not exactly. Harry narrowed his eyes. Goblins were careful with their words. If they chose not to say something, it meant there was more beneath the surface. The vaults deeper than the ones we broke into during the war, Harry said slowly. What's in them? For the first time, Gornick Ironbane looked afraid. The past, the goblin whispered, and things that should never have been woken. They took the minecart deep into the bowels of the bank. The tunnels blurred past, ancient stone carved by hands long forgotten, runes glowing faintly against the walls. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Not a physical cold, but something older, something woven into the very bones of the place. Harry had felt it before, in the Chamber of Secrets, in the Department of Mysteries, in the presence of magic that had been left untouched for too long. Gornock sat stiffly beside him, his fingers wrapped around the lever of the minecart as they descended into the black. You're the first wizard to come this far in over 100 years, Gornock muttered. That makes me feel much better, Harry said dryly. A sharp curve, and suddenly the tracks ended. The cart screeched to a halt at a ledge overlooking a cavern so vast it swallowed sound itself. Harry stepped out, his wand light barely touching the high ceiling above, and there, at the center of the cavern, a single vault door stood wide open. Merlin, Harry whispered. Something had forced its way out. The great steel doors, centuries old, were warped at the edges. The engravings of goblin magic melted as if touched by fire. The enchantments that once sealed them now nothing but charred whispers in the air. Who owned this vault? Harry asked. Gornock did not answer immediately. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, This vault was never owned by any wizard. Harry turned sharply. Then whose was it? Gornock's fingers tightened around his cloak. The first goblins who built Gringotts, he said. Before there were wizards, before there was a ministry, before even the founding of Hogwarts. His voice grew quieter. They sealed something away, something even we feared. Harry stepped closer, feeling the pull of something unseen, as though the air itself leaned toward the empty vault. What was inside? He murmured. The goblin turned his gaze to him, and for the first time since Harry had met him, there was a glimmer of fear in his ancient, knowing eyes. The chest, Gornock whispered, and the locks upon it were woven with magic even goblins do not speak of any more. Harry's stomach tightened. And it's gone, he said. Gornock nodded. The silence between them grew heavy. Harry felt it now. Something wrong in the very air. A presence that should not have been disturbed. The vault did not just open, Mr. Potter, Gornock said. It was forced open. And whatever was inside, it is no longer sleeping. And then, a sound, distant yet near, a whispering rustle. Harry turned sharply, but the shadows in the cavern did not move. Still, the sense of being watched prickled against his skin. Harry drew his wand. He wasn't sure whether it was the vault itself, or something else lurking beyond its threshold, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been locked away, it was not meant to be freed, And now it was out, and it was waiting. The silence within the cavern was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something unseen, something ancient. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the skin, that filled the lungs like a thick mist, that made the bones remember things the mind could not name. The air was leaden with a kind of weight that was not of the earth, but of time itself, heavy with the memory of forgotten voices, sealed doors, and warnings carved into stone in languages that no tongue had spoken in centuries. Harry stood at the threshold of the gaping vault, the tip of his wand casting a cold, silvery glow against the melted edges of the steel doors. The runes once carved into them had been burned away, as though the very magic that had bound this place had been unmade, unraveled down to the last whisper of its existence. He had seen destruction before, had faced the wrath of dark curses, had watched spells clash like warring storms in the heat of battle. But this was different. There was no trace of conflict here, no evidence of a struggle, only the eerie echoing certainty that something had left. Gornuk stood beside him, his breath shallow, his fingers curling round the folds of his cloak with a tension that betrayed his unease. For all the goblins' renowned detachment, their unshakable presence, their guarded, near impenetrable neutrality, this was something else. This was fear. And fear was not something goblins showed lightly. This was not the work of wizards, Gornuk murmured at last, his voice a low thread of sound, stretched taut against the weight of the air. No spell we know could have undone these seals, not without shattering the vault entirely, not without tearing the very foundation of Gringotts apart. Harry turned his gaze toward the goblin, studying the way his usually sharp, calculating expression had softened into something distant, something heavy with the burden of too much knowing. He had seen that expression before, on wizards who had walked too close to something they could not name, something they wished they had never found. Then what did this? Harry asked, his voice quieter than he intended. For a long moment, Gornuk did not answer. He was staring at the melted steel, the edges curling inward like parchment that had been caught in a flame. His eyes narrowed as though he were reading something beyond what was visible. When he finally spoke, it was not with the crisp, clipped certainty that goblins were known for, but with a kind of hesitance, as if he were speaking words that should never have been spoken aloud. There is a kind of magic that is neither ours nor yours, he said, his voice heavy with something close to reverence, or perhaps dread. A magic that predates the wands you carry, the spells you weave, the very language you use to command the world. It is old, so old that it does not even speak, it simply is. He let out a slow breath, as though the weight of saying the words had cost him something. This vault was sealed before wizards ever laid claim to these lands, before the first coin was minted, before the first bargain was struck. And it was not sealed to protect what was inside. It was sealed to protect us from it. Harry felt a slow, creeping chill wrap itself around his spine. There was something in the way Gornuk spoke, something unshaken yet deeply weary, as though he were remembering something he had never seen, only known. It was a tone he had heard before, in the whispers of the centaurs deep in the forbidden forest, in the veiled warnings of the unspeakables in the Department of Mysteries, in the way the headless hunt refused to speak of certain deaths. It was the sound of truth so ancient that even speaking of it felt like waking something best left undisturbed. "And now it's gone," Harry murmured, his voice barely more than breath, barely more than thought. "Yes," Gornuk said, his fingers tightened against the folds of his cloak. "And the vaults, remember." A shiver of something unseen slithered through the air, a flicker of movement just beyond the reach of light, a ripple through the stone itself as if the very walls had exhaled. Harry stiffened, every nerve in his body flaring to attention. He knew this feeling. He had felt it in the corridors of the Department of Mysteries, in the graveyard where Voldemort had returned, in the presence of Dementors, where the very air grew thick with the weight of things long dead. It was not merely the absence of warmth, it was the presence of something else, something that did not belong. His grip tightened around his wand. Something is still here. Gornuk turned sharply, his ears twitching slightly at the edges, his gaze snapping toward the shadows pooling at the edges of the cavern. For a moment they stood in silence, listening, waiting. The vault, emptied yet not empty, seemed to watch them in turn, the very air around them thick with its knowing. And then a sound. It was not loud, not a crash, nor a whisper, not a footstep, nor a breath. It was a sound that existed only in absence, a space where something should have been but wasn't, a displacement of silence. Harry's pulse quickened. His wand was raised, though there was nothing yet to cast a spell against, nothing yet to strike. And yet, he could feel it, the shape of something unseen, pressing against the edges of his awareness, waiting. The shadows at the edge of the cavern did not move, but they were no longer where they had been before. "Something woke when that chest was opened," Gornuk whispered, his voice low, almost reverent, his fingers brushing against the hilt of the dagger at his belt. Something that was not meant to wake. Harry's heart was hammering now, his breath slow and measured as he turned his gaze toward the dark. He knew this feeling. He had stood in places where the walls remembered screams, where the air had soaked in sorrow, where magic had left wounds in the world that did not heal. And this place had not forgotten. The magic here was not dark, not in the way he had learned to understand dark magic. It was not cruel, not twisted by greed or ambition, not shaped by human hands. It was something older, something waiting. And then, from the depths of the vault, where no light reached, something shifted, not with a sound, not with movement, but with an awareness that pressed against the air, that leaned toward them as if it had just noticed them standing there. Harry's breath caught in his throat. The shadows deepened. The cavern exhaled. And from the darkness a voice, low, soft, edged with something that was not quite words, whispered, "You are not the one I was expecting." The vault did not merely feel alive, it was. The vault breathed. It was not the sharp inhalation of life, nor the rhythmic pulse of something warm and flesh-bound. but rather the slow, inexorable shifting of something ancient, awakening to its own existence. It was the movement of forgotten doors stirring on rusted hinges, of ink seeping back into parchment long since turned to dust. It was awareness, coiling through the air like a serpent tasting the wind. The whisper had not been carried by sound. It had simply been as though the space itself had shaped the words from the heavy stillness, from the dense, waiting dark. Harry did not move, but he could feel his own heartbeat in his fingertips, in the base of his throat, in the spaces between his ribs where breath no longer came as easily as it should. His mind, trained by years of combat and instinct, was already mapping the space, assessing exits, testing the weight of the silence, the way the shadows seemed to shift in the periphery of his vision. But there was no threat here, not yet, only that waiting presence, that voice curling through the air, its meaning hanging between them like a blade suspended mid-fall. "You are not the one I was expecting." The words rang through him like a spell cast without incantation. They were not a question, not an accusation, not even disappointment. They were fact, undeniable. Harry swallowed. "And who?" he asked, his voice steady but slow, careful, testing. "Was it you expected?" There was no immediate answer. Instead, something shifted again, but not in the way a person might shift, not in the way of weight pressing against stone or a figure stepping into the half-light. No, this was deeper. A movement not of the body, but of presence, of something vast, thinking, considering. The silence that followed was thick, pressing in against the skin, curling around the edges of his mind like the weight of a dream that was not quite memory, not quite prophecy. Cornic was still beside him, but the goblin had drawn closer, his fingers twitching near the hilt of his dagger. His expression was unreadable save for the tightness around his mouth, the careful stillness and the way his shoulders tensed. He had not drawn his weapon, not yet, but the fact that his fingers hovered near it at all meant he knew. Whatever this was, whatever they had woken, the goblin had feared it before he had even seen it. The darkness did not recede, but the vault seemed to deepen, as though the space had expanded just beyond the reach of their sight. And then, at last, the voice came again. He promised he would return. There was something almost tired in the way it spoke, but not weary, not worn in the way age made things brittle. No, this was something deeper, the tiredness of a long patience, a waiting so profound that time itself had no meaning against it. Harry felt the shape of something he did not understand settle against his mind. He was not prone to superstition, nor did he lean easily toward fear. He had faced death too many times, had stood in its presence and refused to yield. But this was not fear, not in the way he had known it before. This was the recognition of something beyond understanding. "Who promised?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but not softer, just lower, as if some part of him had already acknowledged that raising it would do no good. And this time, there was an answer. "The one who bound me." The vault did not shake, the walls did not tremble, but Harry felt the words ripple through the stone, through the ground beneath his feet, through the very air itself, as though the magic that had been woven into this place had frayed, loosened, was unraveling. For the first time, Gornuk spoke. and when he did, his voice was unlike any tone Harry had heard from a goblin before. "No bindings are meant to last forever," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the empty vault as though he could see something beyond its threshold. "Even those made with the deepest magic will in time erode, and when they do—" He exhaled, shaking his head. "The question is not whether something will escape, but whether it was ever meant to be contained at all." Harry glanced at him, something stirring deep in his thoughts, a thread of realization weaving itself into the edges of his mind. "You knew," he said, his voice not accusing but searching, unraveling the truth as he spoke it. Maybe not the details, maybe not the what, but you knew there was something here that should never have been touched. Gornuk did not look at him. "We have always known there were vaults beneath Gringotts that were not made for gold," he admitted. "The first goblins did not carve this place for wizards alone. They built deep, and in their time they built to hold." His fingers, long and precise, traced the handle of his dagger, as though the motion itself could steady his thoughts. Some things were buried for a reason. Harry turned back to the open vault, the space where something had once rested, where magic had sealed it away, where something had been promised. And now that something was gone. The vault was no longer a prison, but an absence, a void left where something had once waited. He could feel it, the way one feels a room that has been emptied, where presence lingers in the shape of missing things. "Why now?" he murmured. "Why did it break now?" Gornuk exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You ask questions as though time moves the same way for all things, as though waiting 500 years or 5,000 is different for something that has never lived the way we do." He turned his gaze toward Harry, his expression unreadable. Perhaps it did not break now. Perhaps it was merely permitted to break. A chill ran through Harry's spine. By whom? For a long moment, there was only silence. Then from the vault the whisper came again, curling through the dark like a hand reaching beyond the grave. He promised he would return. The vault was empty, but something was still listening. And somewhere, beyond the reach of light, something had been waiting for its promise to be kept. The cavern had grown heavier, not in a way that the body could measure, but in the way that air thickens before a storm, pressing against the lungs, curling into the spaces between thoughts, making every breath feel deeper, slower, more deliberate. The walls of Gringotts had always carried a presence of their own, their foundations laid by hands that did not belong to wizards, their corridors woven with magic older than the very idea of vaults and treasure. But now that presence was no longer silent. It was stirring, stretching into the cracks left behind by whatever had once been contained here, as though the absence had left a hunger in the stones themselves, a hollow place where something should have remained sealed. Harry could feel it in the way his wand vibrated ever so slightly in his grip, the wood sensitive to the unseen shifts in the air, as though the very magic of this place was uncertain whether it should allow them to stand here at all. He had known magic to be many things, a tool, a weapon, a living force that bent to will and emotion. But here it was something else entirely. It was not bending, it was watching. And in the silence, in the lingering echoes of a voice that was neither past nor present, but simply was, he understood that whatever had left this vault had not done so in haste. It had left when it was ready. Gornuk was still staring at the empty space, his long fingers twitching slightly, not with fear, but with something close to calculation, as though trying to trace a pattern in a puzzle that had been carved too deeply into the stone for even his kind to see clearly. His breathing was steady, measured, but his eyes, dark, gleaming in the dim light of Harry's wand, betrayed a flicker of something far older than caution. "We should not be here," the goblin muttered at last, though the words were not a command but a statement of fact, a truth acknowledged rather than spoken as a warning. "This place is not for wizards, nor for goblins. It was not built for coin or for magic of our making. It was carved to keep something in, and we have no way of knowing whether the locks that bound it were ever meant to be opened again." Harry exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the words settle, feeling the way they pressed against his ribs, the way they curled into his thoughts and tangled with questions that had no answers yet. He had spent years in places where darkness clung to the walls, where the remnants of curses stretched their fingers into time itself. But even in those places, even in the halls of Hogwarts, where history breathed through the very stones, even in the ruins of the Riddle House, where echoes of Voldemort's voice still clung to the air like whispers of dying embers, he had always felt that magic, even at its most twisted, was something that could be understood, something that, at its core, obeyed laws, even if those laws were cruel. But this was different. This was something untouched by the hands of men, something that did not care for the divisions between wizards and goblins, between light and dark, between right and wrong. "What exactly did your kind bury here?" he asked, though the question was not born of accusation, only necessity. Gornuk did not answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, his gaze shifting slightly, not toward Harry, but toward something unseen, something that lay beneath the surface of the past, buried beneath centuries of knowledge that had been carefully guarded. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy with something that almost felt like reluctance. "You misunderstand," he said, his fingers still curled near his dagger, not out of readiness but out of habit, as though something in him had been trained to reach for it in places like this. "This vault was not built by my ancestors to hide treasure, nor was it meant to be forgotten. It was built because they feared that what they had bound here could not be destroyed. Not by goblins, not by wizards, not by anything that walks the earth." A chill settled in Harry's chest, curling somewhere deep, somewhere beneath thought, where instinct resided. He had faced things that should not have been, things that should have remained dead, things that had shaped the course of the world long before he had ever stepped into it. But he had never stood in the presence of something that even those who had built this place had not dared to try and end. "What was it?" he pressed, his voice steady, though he could feel his pulse beneath his skin thrumming like something distant, like something trying to keep time with a rhythm that no longer existed. Gornuk hesitated again, and it was that hesitation that sent a deeper unease through Harry's veins, because goblins did not hesitate. Goblins were deliberate. They were calculated. their minds sharp, their knowledge exact. They did not speak unless they knew the weight of their words, and they did not linger in doubt. But this was different. The name is not known to us, the goblin admitted at last, and Harry felt the weight of the truth behind those words, the acknowledgement that something had been lost not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been erased. But we know this. What was bound in this vault was bound before the wands of wizards had names, before Gringotts itself was a vault, before the world you know was shaped into the borders it now holds. And the one who placed it here did not do so to hide it, but to contain it. Harry felt the weight of those words settle over him like the hush before the breaking of a wave. Magic was many things, but it was always named. Even the darkest of spells, the most forbidden of enchantments, the deepest of curses, they all had names. They had origins. They had bloodlines. They had the echoes of the hands that had cast them, the voices that had spoken them into existence. But this, something nameless, something that did not belong to goblins or wizards, something that had been locked away not for greed, nor for secrecy, but out of fear. That was something else entirely. And then, as though the very vault had heard its own story spoken aloud, as though the stones had recognized that what was sealed had been named again, the air grew thicker, not with sound, not with movement, but with something worse, with awareness, with something that was no longer waiting, with something that had already begun to remember itself. Harry stepped forward, just slightly, his breath slow, his grip tightening around his wand without meaning to, his body reacting before his mind had even caught up to what it was feeling, what it was sensing. And then, in the dark, in the silence that had become too full, too loud in its weight, something laughed. Not loud, not cruel, not even truly there, but Harry felt it. And in that moment, he understood that whatever had been bound here had not simply been released. It had been invited back into the world. The laughter did not move through the cavern in any way sound should. It did not echo against the vaulted ceiling, nor did it shift through the cold, stale air in the way footsteps or whispered words might. It did not even exist in the strictest sense, but rather in the way a shadow exists, felt but never truly touched, seen but never held, a shape without form that slithered through the empty vault and settled itself in the hollows of thought and the marrow of bone. It was not the laughter of something human, nor was it the cruel, biting sound of malice Harry had heard from Death Eaters or Dementors or even Voldemort himself. It was something colder, something that carried no amusement, no emotion, no attachment to the world of the living. It was the sound of recognition, as though something in the vault had turned its head at last, as though something buried in time had realized it was no longer alone. Harry's fingers tightened around his wand, his pulse steady but slow, each beat measured like the ticking of a clock counting down rather than forward. He had known darkness before, had felt it press against his ribs and curl into his lungs, had stood on the precipice of death and stared into the abyss, but there had always been something alive in the darkness he had faced, whether it was rage or hatred, or the sheer force of will that defined those who wielded magic for their own ambitions. But this This was not alive, not in the way men or beasts or even cursed objects were. It did not hunger, it did not threaten. It simply was, and that in itself was more unsettling than any darkness he had ever known. Beside him, Gornuk stood utterly still, his long fingers curled into the fabric of his cloak, his sharp eyes narrowed not in fear but in contemplation, as though he too were trying to trace the shape of what had been awakened. Goblins, for all their dealings with gold and contracts and the ever-moving tide of wizarding affairs, were not creatures prone to superstition. They did not linger on the dead, nor did they speak of ghosts in hushed tones the way wizards did, fearing what lay beyond the veil. To goblins the past was a record, a ledger written in steel and stone and blood, nothing more. But here, in the presence of something that did not belong to ledger books or measured truths, even Gornuk did not look entirely certain. He let out a slow breath, measured and careful, and when he spoke his voice was lower than before, as though he knew, as though they both knew, that whatever had awoken in this place was listening. "There are things," he murmured, his words threading through the thick, motionless air, "that do not linger in history because history itself is not enough to contain them. Not all knowledge is forgotten because it is lost. Some things are buried not in time but in silence, because those who came before us understood that to name them is to acknowledge them, and to acknowledge them is to invite them back into the world." Harry turned his head slightly, his eyes flickering toward the goblin, absorbing the words in a way that was deeper than simple hearing, as though they pressed not only against his ears but against something deeper, some part of him that understood that this moment, this vault, this night, had already changed something in the world, whether they realized it or not. "You're saying this was erased on purpose," he said, his voice quiet but steady, his mind threading itself through the implications, weaving possibilities like a map unfolding beneath his thoughts. Not just sealed away, not just hidden, but deliberately erased from memory itself. Gornuk did not nod, but his silence was agreement enough. He let his fingers trace the outline of the dagger at his belt, his grip firm but not tense, as though the feel of steel beneath his hands grounded him in a way that nothing else in this place could. "A vault is not just a place to keep things, Mr. Potter," he murmured. "It is a place to control them, to decide what is worth preserving and what is better left untouched. The oldest vaults beneath Gringotts were not built to guard treasures. They were built to contain the things that should never be taken, never be held, never be named." Harry let the thought settle, let it unspool through the corridors of his mind, where logic warred with instinct, where magic hummed in his blood, but could not quite grasp the shape of what he was standing before. There were many things he had seen in his lifetime that defied logic, but even the darkest of them, Horcruxes, the veil in the Department of Mysteries, the very nature of life and death itself, had still been bound to the world by some fundamental truth, by a magic that could be studied, feared, controlled. But this, whatever had been here, whatever had once rested beneath the weight of time itself, was not magic in the way he had known it. It was not something that could be controlled. It was something that had simply been waiting. And now it was no longer waiting. The whispering shift in the air changed, curling toward him, and for a moment, just a moment, Harry felt something press against the edges of his mind, not as a voice, not as legitimacy, not even as magic, but as a presence. It did not speak. It did not command. It simply let itself be felt, a weight settling in the marrow of his bones, a memory that did not belong to him unfurling in the spaces between thought. A temple of stone, long before it had ever been a vault. Runes carved into the ground, not by wands, not by tools, but by hands that had once feared what they had trapped. A promise made not in words, but in silence. And a chest not as a container, not as a prison, but as a lock to something older than the ground itself. Then a voice, not a whisper, not even a sound, just a thought. The key is turned. The weight withdrew as suddenly as it had come, and Harry let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding, the cavern feeling less for the first time since they had entered, as though whatever had been watching had now turned its gaze elsewhere. Gornuk straightened beside him, his breath steady, but there was something measured in the way he looked toward the vault now, something that had shifted, something that no longer believed they were simply standing before the remnants of something forgotten. "What happens next?" Harry asked, though the question was not meant for Gornuk alone. The goblin did not answer immediately, but when he did, his voice was not just his own. It was the voice of history, of those who had built this place and known what lay beneath its deepest vaults. "We wait," he murmured, "and we see who comes looking for what has been set free." Harry exhaled, feeling the weight of the words settle like a second gravity, the understanding sinking into him as deep as the vault itself. The chest was no longer here, but the promise made to it had not been forgotten. And somewhere, beyond the reach of this cavern, beyond the reach of Gringotts itself, someone was already coming to claim what had been released. The weight of the vault lingered on Harry's skin long after they stepped away from its threshold, the sense of something vast and unseen pressing against the very air, like a ripple traveling outward from the point of something ancient breaking free. It was not just a vault that had been disturbed, not just a chest that had been stolen. It was the balance of something old, something forgotten, something that had been buried beneath layers of silence, its presence lost to time only because those who had lived long enough to name it had decided that it was better left unspoken. And yet, for all their precautions, for all their walls and spells and silent agreements never to return, someone had come. Someone had pried apart the centuries of enchantments and let the darkness unfurl its limbs once more, let it stretch into the world like a beast waking from hibernation. The air within the deeper tunnels of Gringotts did not feel right anymore. It was not merely cold, nor was it touched by the kind of dampness one would expect from being buried so far beneath the surface. It was something else, something that pressed against the ribs, something that made the heart beat slower, as though some unseen hand had reached through the very fabric of the bank's foundation and was testing the weight of those who still walked its hall. Harry could feel it in the marrow of his bones, in the way his wand thrummed faintly in his grip, responding to something that should not be here. They walked in silence, his boots barely making a sound against the smooth ancient stone, the torches on the walls flickering in a way that did not feel entirely natural, as though the flames themselves were uncertain of what had changed. Gornuk, walking beside him, was as rigid as ever, his fingers occasionally brushing the dagger at his belt, though he had not drawn it, as if the mere presence of steel at his side grounded him, as if it tethered him to something solid in a space where the world had begun to shift. It was Harry who finally broke the silence, though his voice was measured, deliberate, the words forming, not because he wanted to speak, but because the weight of unspoken thoughts had grown too heavy. "You knew, didn't you? Not the details, not exactly what was kept here, but you knew that something like this existed, that Gringotts wasn't just a vault for wizarding gold, but something older, something deeper." He did not look at Gornuk as he spoke, instead letting his eyes trace the curve of the tunnel ahead, where the path narrowed slightly, the light from the enchanted sconces casting long shadows against the carved stone. "You said before that the first goblins built vaults to contain things that could not be owned, things that weren't meant to be touched, and yet you still brought me down here. You still let me see it." Gornuk did not answer at first. There was only the sound of their steps, the faint rustle of his cloak as he walked, the soft clicking of his nails against his belt buckle as he adjusted it, as though grounding himself before he spoke. "There are secrets, Potter," he murmured at last, his voice low, measured, like something spoken in a language that was used to holding its words close. "Not all of them belong to wizards, and not all of them belong to goblins. Some secrets belong to the earth itself, to the spaces where no sun has ever touched, where even time moves differently. The oldest vaults in Gringotts were not built for men or goblins. They were carved into the stone by hands that understood that some things do not simply disappear. They do not fade." Harry let those words settle, his mind tracing their weight, turning them over, letting them shape themselves into something tangible. He thought of the Department of Mysteries, of the way time itself had been held within a room full of shimmering glass, each one a fragile vessel for something far greater than the human mind could fully comprehend. He thought of the veil, of the whispering voices beyond it, of the way death had always felt like a boundary rather than an end, a place where something continued to move even when it could no longer be seen. "And now," he said, his voice quieter, though not softer, "this thing, whatever was in that chest, whatever was sealed away, someone wanted it back." Gornuk exhaled, a sound that was neither amusement nor agreement, but something in between, something that belonged to a creature who had spent centuries watching wizards make mistakes, watching them dig up things they did not understand simply because they could. "Perhaps," the goblin said, his fingers tracing the seam of his cloak where silver embroidery gleamed faintly under the dim light, "or perhaps they wanted to wake it." Harry slowed his steps just slightly, his thoughts knotting around that sentence like a rope pulled too tight. Waking something is different than stealing it. Waking something is different than possessing it. Waking something means you want it to move. He felt the pieces shifting, aligning themselves in a way that he did not yet fully grasp, but there was one thing he did know. Whatever had once rested in that vault, whatever had been locked away for centuries beyond counting, had not merely been contained. It had been sealed, locked behind layers of magic that were not meant to break, not meant to be undone by time or greed or even power. And yet someone had broken them anyway. Gornuk stopped suddenly, and Harry turned his gaze toward him, noting the way the goblin's fingers had tensed against the hilt of his dagger, not in preparation for a fight, but in a way that suggested something had changed. The air, already heavy, had grown thicker, the temperature dropping just slightly. Not enough to be noticeable at first, but enough that the torches along the walls flickered again, their light dimming for just a moment longer than before. "What is it?" Harry asked, his voice quiet, controlled, but there was already something stirring in his chest, some instinct that told him they were no longer alone. Gornuk did not answer with words. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his sharp goblin ears twitching just barely, listening. Then, without a word, he gestured with one long, clawed finger toward the far end of the corridor, where the shadows did not seem to behave as they should, where the darkness pooled a little too thickly, a little too deliberately, as though it were not simply an absence of light, but the presence of something else. Harry followed his gaze, his breath slow, steady, the grip on his wand firm but unhurried. He had learned long ago that fear was something that could be smelled, something that could be sensed, something that fed the things that lurked in places like this. And yet, as he took another step forward, as his wand light cut through the dimness, he knew in a way that had nothing to do with logic, nothing to do with spells or enchantments or things that could be named, that whatever was ahead was not waiting for them to come closer. It was already watching. And then, from the far end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of the light, something moved. It did not step forward. It did not speak. It did not reveal itself fully. But it shifted, just enough for Harry to feel the air stir against his skin, just enough for the torchlight to flicker in response, just enough for the space between them to feel smaller than it had before. And then, a whisper, not from the corridor, not from the thing beyond it, but from the walls themselves. A voice, low and weightless, sliding through the very stone like breath curling through a dying fire. "It has begun." The words did not merely exist in sound, they arrived in the air like a ripple across still water, threading through the very stone as though the vaults themselves had exhaled their long-held breath. "It has begun." The phrase was not spoken so much as it was revealed, unfurling like an old scroll in the deep recesses of a tomb, a whisper that did not belong to any voice, but rather to the walls themselves, to the weight of time pressing down upon this place, to the ancient, unseen eyes that had been waiting in the dark for far too long. Harry felt it in his chest, in the slow, creeping cold that seemed to coil just beneath his ribs, an ache that had nothing to do with fear in the way he had known it before. It was not the kind of fear that came with the presence of a visible enemy, nor the sharp, immediate terror of a wand raised in battle. No, this was something older, something deeper, the kind of fear that settles into the bones of those who stand too close to the unknown. A dread that did not demand to be confronted, but instead asked to be understood. The tunnel stretched before them, its walls narrowing as they moved further into the heart of Gringotts' forgotten depths. The sconces along the stone corridors flickered, their enchanted flames dimming at odd intervals, as though the very magic that had once breathed life into this place was now hesitating, uncertain, resisting whatever had begun to awaken. The air was thick with dust, not the stagnant, motionless dust of an abandoned space, but something that still moved, swirling faintly in currents that did not belong to their footsteps alone. It was as though the vaults themselves had begun to breathe, as though something in the darkness had turned its attention toward them, measuring them, weighing them against whatever memory had been left behind. Harry's grip on his wand tightened, not out of fear, but out of an instinctive, familiar tension, one that had been sharpened by years of learning that the world did not simply react to the presence of magic. It responded to it. He had seen it before in the Forbidden Forest, in the way the very trees had whispered of ancient things that did not belong in the light. He had felt it in the graveyard where Voldemort had returned, the air thick with magic so old and so twisted that it had left behind an imprint even long after the moment had passed. Magic did not die, not really. It left echoes like footprints in the sand, waiting for someone to step too close. Beside him, Gornock walked in silence, but Harry did not miss the way the goblin's shoulders had stiffened, the way his long fingers traced absent patterns over the silver embroidery on his cloak, as though feeling for something unseen. Goblins did not believe in superstition. They did not speak of ghosts the way wizards did, nor did they whisper of curses in the way those who feared them might, but they did believe in debts, in the balance of things, in the weight of oaths and consequences, and in the understanding that not all doors were meant to be opened simply because they could be. Gornock let out a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something that had been sitting in his mind for much longer than the few moments they had spent in the vaults. "You know, Potter, there are many things wizards do not think to question. You build your towers, carve your castles, weave your spells into the very stones of your foundations, and yet so rarely do you wonder what came before them. What hands built the roads beneath your feet? What was buried long before you arrived to claim the land for yourselves? Wizards inherit the world as though it is theirs by right, and yet you have never truly been the first to walk these halls." Harry turned his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward the goblin, though he did not speak just yet. He let the words settle, let them sink into the moment, let them brush against his thoughts in a way that forced him to consider the truth that had always existed in the background, a truth so ancient that it had never needed to be spoken. Goblins had built Gringotts, yes, but what had existed before that? Before the first wizard claimed a wand, before the first spell had been spoken, before the ministry, before the founders, before any of them had come to understand how little of the world they truly knew? And now here they stood, not as thieves, not as owners, but as witnesses, standing in the presence of something that neither of their kinds had truly controlled, something that had existed long before vaults and ledgers and laws, before gold and wands, before even the oldest records could trace its name. What was here before Gringotts? Harry asked at last, his voice quiet, but there was an edge to it now, a curiosity that was no longer idle, no longer theoretical, no longer detached from the reality they were facing. Gornik did not answer immediately. He stopped walking, his gaze sweeping over the walls, over the carved runes that had long since faded into the stone, their edges softened by time, by the weight of something pressing against them for centuries beyond counting. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the nearest engraving, his touch lingering there for a moment longer than necessary, as though feeling for something beyond the stone itself. Then finally he spoke. "We were not the first," he murmured, and there was something distant in his voice, something not quite his own, as though he was speaking words that had been spoken before, as though they had been waiting to be heard again. Before wizards, before goblins, before men drew lines in the dirt and called them borders, before they gave names to the rivers and the mountains and the stars, before magic had rules. He turned then, his dark eyes sharp, piercing, as though he was seeing not just Harry, but something behind him, beyond him, something stretching back through time like a thread pulled too tight. "There was something else," Gurnuk said, his voice lower now, the weight of history pressing into his every syllable. Something that did not build with hands, something that did not need wands to bend the world to its will, something that did not need names, because it was never meant to be spoken of at all. Harry felt a slow chill creep down his spine, not from the air, not from the weight of the vaults, but from understanding, from the realization that whatever had been sealed here, whatever had been stolen, had not simply been hidden because it was dangerous. It had been hidden because it had no place in the world they had built. And now it was loose. Harry exhaled, slow, steady, his mind racing through possibilities, through what this meant, through what had already begun. He had faced many things before, dark lords, ancient curses, shadows that lurked in the corners of history, but never had he faced something that did not belong to history at all. The air was still now, too still, as though the very weight of what had been spoken had silenced the vaults themselves. And then, just at the edge of hearing, just beyond the reach of light, the whisper came again. "You are not the first to come looking." The vaults breathed, and Harry realized, with a slow, dawning certainty, that they were no longer alone. The walls of the vault did not move, and yet Harry could feel them tightening around him, as though the very weight of the stone had begun to press inward. The ancient magic woven into these foundations, reacting to something unseen, something that had awakened from the long slumber it had never been meant to leave. The air itself had a density now, a weight that clung to his skin like damp mist before a storm, thick with unspoken warnings, with the kind of silence that did not simply exist in absence of sound, but rather in the presence of something listening. He had felt this before in different ways in different places, in the graveyard at Little Hangleton, in the whispering corridors of the Department of Mysteries, in the ruined Chamber of Secrets where time had bent itself into the shape of an old battle and refused to move forward. But this was different. This was not merely the imprint of magic left behind. This was not a place waiting to be discovered. This was a place that had already been found. The whisper had not been sound in the way voices normally were. It had not carried across the tunnel, had not bounced off the vaulted ceiling or slid through the cracks between stone. It had been present, immediate, weightless, settling not in the air but in the mind, a thought that did not belong to him but had somehow found purchase inside his head. You are not the first to come looking. The words curled at the edges of his consciousness, wrapping around something unspoken, something half-formed, and yet in that single phrase, in that undeniable truth, a new and terrible understanding began to take shape. Gornuk had gone still beside him, and in the flickering light of the enchanted torches, Harry could see the way the goblin's fingers twitched faintly against the hilt of his dagger, not in fear, but in calculation, as though his body were already measuring the weight of whatever had just brushed against them. Goblins were not creatures prone to superstition, nor did they fear the things wizards whispered about in the dark. Their kind had built this place not out of reverence, but out of necessity, carving through the earth with a precision that no human hand could match, sealing away treasures and truths alike. And yet here they stood, not as keepers of this vault, not as its owners. For a long moment neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say, not yet. Not while the presence of that voice still hung in the air, not while the echo of its truth still wrapped itself around the stones. And then, slowly, carefully, Harry exhaled. "Someone else has been here," he murmured, the words tasting heavier than they should, as though they carried the weight of centuries. His voice did not rise above a whisper. Not because he was afraid, but because something in him knew in a way that was deeper than thought, knew in the way instinct knows the difference between being watched and being seen. That speaking too loudly would be a mistake. Gornuk did not turn his head, did not shift his stance, did not do anything that might suggest uncertainty. But when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, his usual sharp precision softened by something that might have been consideration, or perhaps something closer to recognition. "It was never going to stay buried forever," he muttered, and though the words should have been bitter, they were not. No vault remains sealed forever. No promise holds beyond the lifetime of those who make it. Harry frowned slightly, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead, letting the dim torchlight carve the space into something tangible, letting his thoughts arrange themselves into some kind of order. "You knew this was going to happen," he said, and though there was no accusation in his tone, there was something searching in it. Something that needed to understand why, if the goblins had always known this vault would one day be opened, they had done nothing to prevent it. Gornuk let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly, as though measuring his words before letting them go. "No," he admitted after a moment. "Not like this. Not today, not here, not by these hands. But we knew that what was placed here was not meant to last. Goblins do not believe in eternity, Potter. We do not believe in unbreakable things. We understand that time is not a lock, that magic is not a chain, that what is bound today will always find a way to be unbound tomorrow. The wizards who came before you, the ones who built their towers and their castles and their vaults, the ones who thought themselves architects of permanence, they never understood that." His lips curled faintly, the closest thing to a smirk Harry had seen from him all night. "But we did." Harry let those words sink in, let them settle into the cracks of his thoughts, Let them press against the shape of something larger, something unfolding just beneath the surface of his mind. Magic was not a chain. It was not something that could be kept in a vault, not truly, not forever. It was not a treasure to be hoarded, nor a secret to be buried. Magic moved, it lived, and just as surely as it could be used to bind, it could just as easily be used to call something back. His grip on his wand shifted slightly, not in preparation for battle, but in something else, something closer to awareness, an understanding that had not fully formed yet, but was beginning to take shape in the spaces between his thoughts. Then this was never about keeping something locked away, he said slowly, letting the idea breathe, letting it become real as he spoke it aloud. This was about waiting until the right hands came looking for it again. Gornuk inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, not in confirmation, but in something close to acknowledgement. "You are thinking like a goblin now," he murmured, and though his tone was unreadable, there was something else in it, something deeper. "That should concern you." Harry did not smile, did not let himself be distracted by the weight of that statement. His thoughts were moving faster now, his mind assembling the fragments of what had happened, the truth lurking just beyond his reach. Someone had come here before them. Someone had sought out this vault not to steal, but to wake. But if that was true, then his breath caught, his heart skipping just slightly as the realization struck him, as the pieces aligned all at once, as the space around him suddenly felt much, much smaller than it had before. "If someone else came looking for it," he murmured, voice low, steady, careful, "then why is there no sign of them?" And in the silence that followed, in the heavy, expectant pause that pressed against his chest, Harry understood the answer before Gornya could say it, because they had never left. The vault was empty, but they were not alone, and somewhere in the thick shadows stretching beyond the reach of torchlight, something moved. The air in the vault did not stir, did not shift, did not so much as tremble with the weight of a breath, and yet Harry felt the unmistakable pull of presence, the slow, deliberate press of something unseen curling through the stagnant darkness like fingers running along the edges of a locked door, testing for a weakness, for an opening, for something to push through. It was not a sudden thing, not a moment of revelation or discovery, but rather a feeling that had always been there, lurking at the edges of thought, waiting for him to finally understand. This was not the realization that something was coming. It was the understanding that it was already here. He did not turn, did not shift his stance, did not let his body betray even the smallest flinch, but his grip on his wand tightened ever so slightly, not in preparation for a fight, but in recognition of the moment before one began, the moment before the air broke, before the silence split, before something stepped forward from the dark and changed the shape of the world. He had felt this before, in places where time had stretched itself thin, where magic had tangled itself into something too dense to be undone, in the presence of things that did not move like men, that did not think like men, that did not exist within the fragile borders of what could be called alive. Gornuk had gone still beside him, his sharp eyes flickering between the shifting shadows, his long fingers no longer resting near his dagger, but curled around its hilt, his stance low, careful, deliberate, a creature of instinct rather than panic. He had seen many things in his lifetime, had stood before vaults that had not been opened in centuries, had walked through tunnels that no wizard had ever seen, had felt the weight of enchantments so old that even goblin magic could not decipher their purpose. And yet, as they stood there in the depths of Gringotts, in the lowest vaults where things had been buried not just by stone but by silence itself, Harry could feel something very close to hesitation rolling through the air between them. Not fear, not caution, but something more precise, something colder, something more calculating. Gornik was not afraid of what was in the dark. He was measuring it, and that, more than anything else, sent a slow, crawling chill down Harry's spine. Then, as though deciding the moment had ripened, the darkness shifted, not in movement, not in shape, but in awareness, as if the thing that had been watching them, the thing that had been listening to their thoughts, to their words, had at last made up its mind. And this time, when the whisper came, it did not settle in the air like mist curling through stone. It spoke behind his eyes. "You see now, don't you?" Harry's breath did not hitch, did not catch, did not falter, but it took effort. It took something forceful to keep it steady, because the voice was not simply pressing against his mind, it was coiling through it, threading through the cracks of his thoughts, slithering into the places where instinct lived, where memory folded in on itself, where logic had no hold. It was not a voice made of air, not a thing shaped by lungs and throat and tongue. It was a thing made of recognition, of inevitability, of something that had always been here, waiting to be understood. "You were never meant to find me." Harry let out a slow, steady exhale, let his wand shift just slightly in his fingers, not raising it, not wielding it, but simply acknowledging that there was something to wield it against. "I don't think I was the one looking for you," he murmured, his voice quiet but not weak, not tentative, only considering, only searching, only careful. "But someone was, and they found you, didn't they?" A silence stretched between them, thick and slow, curling like ink spilled into still water. And then the voice, no, not the voice, the presence, the thing that had pressed itself against his mind, the thing that had let itself be woken, spoke again. "I was not found. I was freed." Something shifted at the edges of the torchlight, not a figure, not a shape, not a shadow, but the suggestion of something that had never needed form to exist. The flames flickered once, bending inward rather than outward, as though the light itself was being drawn in, consumed, erased. Harry's mind moved fast, mapping what he knew, what he had seen, what he had heard, what had been left unsaid. "You were locked away," he said slowly, letting the words settle, letting them be tested, letting them hang in the air like bait on a hook. "Not because you were meant to be forgotten, not because you were meant to be erased, but because you were meant to stay. This wasn't a prison. It was an anchor. There was a pause, not hesitation, not silence, but something like the moment before a breath, the moment before a step, the moment before a decision. Yes. Gornuk's grip on his dagger tightened. His jaw had set into something firm, something unreadable. His gaze locked onto the shifting edges of shadow where the torchlight had begun to warp. Someone didn't just steal a chest, the goblin said, his voice lower now, as though he were speaking not just to Harry, but to the thing that had once been inside it. They unchained something, and now it's moving. Not moving, the voice corrected, and this time Harry swore he felt it smiling, though it had no mouth, though it had no face, though it had nothing at all that could be called human. Returning. The word settled, curling into the spaces between their thoughts, shaping itself into meaning, into understanding, into something that had already begun. Because this was not a mistake. This was not an accident. And whoever had opened the chest had not simply stolen something. They had sent it back. The torchlight flickered again, not erratically, not as though struggling against something physical, but in acknowledgement, in reverence, in recognition of something it had always known but never needed to name. Harry turned his head slightly, his mind moving too fast now, too many threads weaving into something whole, too many pieces coming together all at once. Too much he understood now. Too much he had been standing too close to, too much that was already happening. He met Gornuk's eyes. The goblin met his. Neither of them spoke, because neither of them needed to. They both knew. The chest was gone, and whatever had been locked inside it had already left, not into Gringotts, not into the tunnels, into the world. And somewhere far above, in the streets of London, in the places where the air did not yet know that something had changed, where people still moved through their lives without understanding that the sky itself had shifted, the wind was already whispering something new, something that had been waiting, something that had been promised, something that had come home.